Thank goodness. Thank goodness that even atheists and humanists get this weekend off. This morning, I'm going to talk about Thanksgiving. Is it a religious holiday? Is it a secular holiday? And how can humanists celebrate Thanksgiving if we so choose to? So I never really thought of Thanksgiving as a secular or as a religious holiday. And when I mentioned that I was going to talk about secular Thanksgiving to a few people, either on Facebook or whatever, they didn't really get the idea that there was a religious holiday. And there's plenty of room up front if you can't hear in the back. So what do people do on Thanksgiving, and why might it be a religious holiday? So in my family, Thanksgiving is sort of just about gathering with friends and family, and we reflect on what we're thankful for, and we eat a lot. Turkey or tofurkey, which I've heard is awful, stuffing, cranberries, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, yams, the whole smorgasbord. And we drink and we celebrate. But then I started actually looking into a bit of the history and a bit of the surrounding of Thanksgiving for today's presentation. And I'll just read you the first few lines of what Gregor Robertson, Mayor of Vancouver, said on Friday about Thanksgiving as he gave his grace. As we sit down to this meal of humanely raised, certified organic, biodynamic, locally grown, non-medicated, carbon-neutral, free-range turkey, farmers market yams and Brussels sprouts, kale, and carrots from our own garden, we thank you, the Creator who goes by many names, God, Ishvara, Washiguru, Yahweh, Vishnu, and Allah, just to name a few. And he goes on and names all the things he's thankful for and the things he's thankful that he hasn't screwed up again. But for those who haven't heard of it before, biodynamic farming that is mentioned in there is a holistic agriculture technique based on astrology and essentially magic potions that are buried into the ground to help the plants grow. But we're not here to talk about biodynamic farming today and why I think it's funny. We're here to talk about Thanksgiving. So looking further into Canadian Thanksgiving, which we would think would be the most secular Thanksgiving given this country, but the Act of Parliament that formalized this modern holiday was passed on January 31st, 1957, and it proclaimed a day of general thanksgiving to Almighty God for the bountiful harvest for which Canada has been blessed, to be observed on the second Monday of October. So thank goodness this holiday is open to all Canadians, even if we don't have to thank the Almighty. But like I said, I had a very secular Thanksgiving in my mind, which sort of came from what I grew up with. My family every year would take us on an annual camping trip to Writing on Stone Provincial Park, which is in southern Alberta, and if you ever get a chance, I'd highly recommend it. It's a fantastic bit of Canadian and First Nations history on the Milk River near the Canada-US border. The park's famous for its hoodoos, rock formations left by water erosion, and rock etchings there left by centuries and millennia of First Nations before us. They show life on the prairies before roads, cities, and cars. Some of the etchings even show the line where European settlers started to arrive as horses and guns make an appearance in this carving. So it's a great sort of stretch of history. Definitely recommend it. Great hiking. Our Thanksgiving consisted of meeting at this campground with a number of our family friends and having a giant turkey dinner on the Sunday evening. When the weather was chillier, all of us would cram into our parents' 14-foot trailer, and we'd have over a dozen people in this tiny little trailer eating giant meals. That was the Thanksgiving I grew up with. So no one said grace, and we didn't really go around saying what we were thankful for. We just enjoyed one another's company and the good food. So for today's topic, I didn't see any inherent contradiction between humanism and Thanksgiving. I feel as though I grew up on a basically humanist Thanksgiving. I mean, my family never called ourselves atheist or religious. We just didn't go to church, and we didn't really talk about religion other than when my dad made jokes, which he did a lot. But let's look at the history of this holiday for a little bit. First from my own naive understanding, and then we'll take a bit more of a historical perspective. When I think about Thanksgiving, I think about the harvest. I grew up on a farm, so Thanksgiving always fell during or around the time my dad was finishing swathing and combining his fields, or harvesting the crops. And the holiday was just sort of a natural celebration in time for the collection of enough food to last us the winter, or in the modern era, enough crops to pay the bills and make sure we could keep planting grains the next year. So even the timing of Thanksgiving made sense to me. As Canadian Thanksgiving's in October. It's a month earlier than the U.S. Thanksgiving because it gets colder here. It just makes sense. Winter comes early, so we need to harvest our crops before the frost destroys them. So Thanksgiving always made sense as sort of a secular holiday to me, and I think I'd even convinced myself it was one of the few real sort of secular holidays. Christmas and Easter are obviously religious. So Thanksgiving wasn't based on the sort of superstitions of the birth or resurrection of Jesus Christ, or even Passover, which is the holiday when God spared the Jewish children as he massacres the firstborn of Egypt. So Thanksgiving seemed like a better holiday than these other ones. But instead I thought of Thanksgiving as sort of a harvest festival about collective human achievement over the weather and climate. But even better than that just collective triumph, it's that it's not a militaristic one, it's a social one. So Thanksgiving is about our triumph of getting enough food and having enough of this and having wealth, or having enough food and company to keep us warm through the winter. It felt like a very good humanistic kind of holiday, which made sense for me, and it made sense for me to be thankful for these things. I like food, I like friends, I like family. Who doesn't? Oh, some people might not like their family. Unfortunately, though, like most common sense ideas, I was blissfully naive. So here's my brief attempt to give a history of Thanksgiving as gleaned from the pages of Wikipedia. Remember, my background is physics, not history, so forgive me if I err or overgeneralize, and correct me when I'm wrong in the discussion we'll have after. Most cultures have always celebrated some kind of harvest festival, but the first days of Thanksgiving were celebrated by Puritans in Europe in the 16th century as one of only 2 holidays they allowed themselves. They didn't like celebrating very much, so they had days of fasting when things were really bad and they needed to conserve. And they had days of Thanksgiving when they needed to celebrate, or felt like they wanted to recognize divine providence. So it wasn't so much they wanted to celebrate as God did something good and we should be thankful for that. So for example, some of the first Thanksgiving days were called when the British defeated the Spanish Armada, or the deliverance of Queen Anne. And they also held an annual Thanksgiving Day after the gunpowder plot of 1605 failed, and that Thanksgiving is now known as Guy Fawkes Day. Canada's Thanksgiving dates back to the early European settlers and explorers, namely Martin Frobisher. After a particularly treacherous attempt to discover the Northwest Passage in 1578, Frobisher called for the first Thanksgiving in Canada to give thanks to God for his crew's safe journey home. The ceremony was officiated by preacher Robert Wolfel. Wolfel was described as, quote, a learned man appointed by Her Majesty's Council to be their minister and preacher, he made unto them a godly sermon, exhorting them especially to be thankful to God for their strange and miraculous deliverance in those dangerous places. As part of the first Thanksgiving, they celebrated communion, and, quote, the celebration of divine mystery was the first sign, scale, and confirmation of Christ's name, death, and passion ever known in all these quarters. So the first Canadian Thanksgiving was as religious of a celebration as they could make it, where it wasn't luck and the hard work of Frobisher's crew and support on his, people working on his boat that saved their lives. It was God. But with any Canadian tradition, there's also the French side of the story. There's also the native side of the story, of course, but that one doesn't come into Thanksgiving, which is mainly a European tradition. But I'll give the French side, which is better. Samuel de Champlain gets credit for starting harvest festivals in the early 17th century in New France, and these did occasionally include First Nations, probably in similar ways to the American idealized Thanksgiving brought them in. In 1606, de Champlain created the Order of Good Cheer out of a belief that scurvy was caused by idleness. We have silly ideas now, they had silly ideas then. The good thing about this silly idea the idea was that to cure scurvy, settlers needed plenty of food and entertainment to inoculate themselves all winter. So the order involved weekly feasts and celebrations from the harvest until March, ensuring that the settlers would make it through the cold Canadian winters. So basically they just got around every week and ate and partied all winter, and that's what they called Thanksgiving, and it was the Order of Good Cheer. I think some of you are sold on this already. The first toast of the order went as follows: "We meet tonight to witness an event that will, I pray, go ringing down the years, at marking the sure founding of the order, which God and France shall ever serve as beacon to our goal." But besides this one reference to God in that first toast, the Order of Good Cheer seems to be a mostly secular idea, and arguably even a humanist one. It called for the early settlers to just come together, share their food, and liven one another's spirits as a means of coping with the long winter. I mean, in many ways, the Thanksgiving I described earlier as my childhood were very similar in nature, although we didn't have weekly feasts with everyone we knew. I'll just add one final word about the Order of Good Cheer. From what I read, it is possible today to become a member of the Order of Good Cheer. And to become a member, I think you have to be invited by the province of Nova Scotia or a current chevalier or a member of the order. And you must promise to visit the province of Nova Scotia if you haven't yet. So basically you get invited, go to Nova Scotia, you can be a member of the Order of Good Cheer. And these rules were reaffirmed by the Speaker of the House of Nova Scotia in 2001. So it's not like 200 years ago, it's 12 years, 11 years ago. But getting back to the growth of Canadian Thanksgiving, as more immigrants arrived from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and later the Loyalists came to Canada fleeing the Revolution in the United States, our Harvest Festival adopted traditions from all over the place, as Canada usually does. And so this is where we get turkeys and cornucopias and pumpkins. We just sort of steal and mix everything together and we call it a culture. Thanksgivings occurred sporadically over the next 100 years. For example, in 1816, it was celebrated in honor of the end of war between France and Britain. But even more funny is Lower Canada celebrated this Thanksgiving on May 21st, while Upper Canada waited until June 18th. So it wasn't always a coordinated thing. And Thanksgiving wasn't always a fall festival, so there's a separate Thanksgiving tradition and harvest festivals. In 1838, Lower Canada celebrated a Thanksgiving to mark the end of the Lower Canadian Rebellion. But the first sort of Canadian Thanksgiving celebrated after Confederation was on April 5th, 1872, to mark the recovery of Prince of Wales from an illness. So even until the 1870s, they were still calling days of Thanksgiving just to celebrate things that seemed miraculous or worth celebrating. I guess it'd be like a parade after we win the Grey Cup. Would be our modern days of Thanksgiving.
Something serious.
But our modern fall Thanksgiving was basically finalized by 1879, when we began to celebrate annually, either in honor of the harvest or just another random event that happened in fall that seemed worth celebrating. And it switched back and forth between October and November a lot. And it was generally held in November in Canada until Remembrance Day was created following the First World War. Thanksgiving officially became the second Monday of October with the Act of Parliament 1957. So this official holiday isn't even that old. Now, with a broad glossing over the history of Thanksgiving, let's consider the contemporary holiday, and perhaps some ways that humanists can avoid it should you choose to, because humanism is all about your freedom to do whatever you think is good. Obviously, being a naturalistic philosophy, humanists won't be thanking God or saying grace before our feasts. But I think there is value in taking at least one day a year to remind us to recognize what it is we have to be thankful for. I like to think that humanists have some recognition of our species' own fallibilities. For example, we are very easily caught up in this consumerist society. We get up, go to work, come home, eat dinner, go to bed, repeat, repeat, repeat. We understand we should be thankful every day, but our monkey brains are very easily distracted. You know, there's shiny things we want to buy, there's TV on. So picking that one day a year can be really useful to help us reflect and people argue we don't need a Thanksgiving Day, we should be thankful every day, but we forget. So having a day is useful. And it's especially easy as we are generally well off, everyone who's able to come here, because we all have food, shelter, and the time to come to a humanist meeting on a Sunday morning. So it's very easy for us to forget the number of privileges we all have. As a white, educated young male myself living in a developed country, I don't face the day-to-day hardships and the reality for many people in this city, across this country, and around the world. Taking one day to remember and reflect on these issues should be especially important for humanists. And the bitter irony here, of course, is that Thanksgiving can also be seen through a more critical lens than I offered before. We can recognize sort of Canada's colonial history of this country, which was built on the exploitation of the First Nations. Thanksgiving is seen by many as a celebration of the cruel conquest of the Europeans over North America. So taking a little bit of time in Thanksgiving to sort of reflect on this, I think, is very important. Here in British Columbia especially, we should not forget this province wasn't ceded to the European settlers, and much of this province is not under any treaty. Here in Vancouver, it's built on the unceded land of the Coast Salish First Nations. So make sure to take time over this holiday to remember the complete history of this country. This Thanksgiving, I have many things to be thankful for. Good luck, good privilege, and good opportunity. Good food, as I'll have tonight. Good friends and good family. But I won't be thanking God, thank goodness.